Recently, especially since the last escalation of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, there has been a new wave of anti-Semitism. I am neither an expert in the Middle East, nor I am a historian of the Holocaust or Jewish history in general. However, when it comes to Russia, I would like to address several popular misconceptions about the role of Jewish people in Russian history and Christianity in particular. Just like in discussions on Israel and Palestine, World War II, or the Middle Ages, most commenters on Russian history largely ignore details. They usually take one side and automatically assume that their opponents are evil. History and geopolitics almost never work this way. In exceptional cases, we can say, for instance, that the Nazi regime was evidently evil and the Allied nations were 100% justified in their military campaign against the Axis. However, even in that case, there is an important context that is commonly missing, especially in online discussions shaped by short tweets and overwhelming emotions. The discussion on the rise of Nazism, former allies of Hitler who were eventually forced to defend against his aggression, and all the mistakes of the post-World War governments that caused the popularity of the Nazi message, all these points are usually neglected. Even more so when it comes to more controversial events such as Israel versus Palestine, where both sides have blood on their hands as well as territorial claims backed by history. Another example is the relations between Jews and various medieval states and cities. This goes back centuries and is so rich in historical, political, economic and religious contexts that even experts still have active discussions on what actually happened and why. When it comes to Russia, the so-called Jewish question is by no means an easy one. I have neither the time nor the expertise to unfold it in a YouTube video. However, I will address some of the most popular myths about the role of Jewish people in Russian history and Christianity. The first idea is that the Bolsheviks were Jews. This myth is sometimes formulated as Jews murdered the Russian Orthodox Tsar, or Jews forced atheism on Russian people. As I have discussed on my channel, Nicholas II was ethnically only 256th Russian, which makes him probably less Russian than Lenin, who, although he had mixed background, including Jewish, Kalmyk, Chuvash and German blood, was seemingly at least a quarter Russian. Both cases, however, testify to a tremendous ethnic diversity in all socialist states in Russia. Let us, however, talk about Bolsheviks. Most of their political opponents, both before and during the revolutionary period and the following civil war, had distinct ethnic policies. They were either openly pro-Russian and anti-Semitic or covertly prioritized certain ethnic, religious and cultural groups over others. Bolsheviks, however, were Marxists. Whether they followed the teaching of Karl Marx to a T or not, one of the foundational ideas was a radically new social identity. Marxism divides people into two social classes: those who own the means of production, called capitalists, and those who work for them and are subsequently oppressed. The promised new social order, called communism, is meant to abolish this distinction and distribute the means of production across all people according to their needs. Marx and most of his followers, including Lenin, repeatedly claimed that class identity prevails over anything else, including citizenship or ethnicity. One of the criticisms of the Russian involvement in the First World War was that it was the imperial war, because Russian workers had much more in common with German workers than with their fellow Russians of a different social class. If you remember the communist slogan, "Proletarians of all countries unite," it meant exactly that. Russian workers, German workers, English workers, whatever their ethnicity, language, cultural background or nationality, for Marxism they were the same social class fighting against their oppressors worldwide. In this manner, when Bolsheviks organized as a political party and later a military force, they were one of the very few groups that abolished ethnic discrimination and even ethnic distinctions. For Jews suffering oppression and discrimination for centuries prior, the Bolsheviks were the party that welcomed them in any role or position. Many active people of Jewish descent took the opportunity to make use of their energy and talents to build up a political or military career and eventually gain political power, something that was previously unattainable to them. History shows that the series of revolutions at the beginning of the 20th century, and especially the Civil War, were horrific and bloody. All sides committed unthinkable atrocities, human life and dignity amounted to practically nothing, and the country was torn apart and drowned in blood. Bolsheviks stood out from all other forces by virtue of their victory. The war crimes and terror of their opponents shade away simply because the Bolsheviks won, took power, and established their own regime. The role of Jewish people in the Bolshevik movement was quite significant. However, this is not because of their ethnicity, culture, or religion. They simply had few other ways to power and glory than the Bolshevik party. There were large numbers of Jewish people who opposed the Soviet power, but they had no political or military force that could represent them, and most either surrendered, emigrated abroad, or perished in the waves of terror. The second myth is that Orthodox Christianity is against Jews. Even if we ignore the Judaic roots of Christianity and the Bible and the role of the people of Israel in the scriptures preached and taught by the Church, we still cannot say that the Russian Orthodox Church is anti-Semitic. Naturally, some believers and even clergymen can have such views and express them publicly. Before the revolution of 1917, Jews were largely discriminated against, and with the exception of those who converted to Christianity, married outside of their ethnicity, and were eventually gradually losing their Jewish identity, there could not be a Jewish priest or bishop. After the Bolshevik came to power, ethnic discrimination was formally abolished, although decades of deportation and forced assimilation clearly demonstrated that it was not the case. When it comes to Jews, they experienced several waves of anti-Semitic campaigns and even pogroms before and during the Civil War. Many claimed their ethnicity and emigrated to Israel or the USA in the 1970s. Although xenophobia and racism were always there, as anywhere else in the world, the Soviet society was one of the most ethnically diverse populations in the world. Due to forced displacement as well as voluntary seeking for opportunities and intermarriages, people of many ethnicities, languages, cultural and religious backgrounds often lived together, especially in the big cities. My own family, despite being predominantly ethnic Russians, lived all across the Soviet Union, in Central Asia, Siberia, Far East, Central and Northwest Russia, Latvia, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and so on. Hence, inevitably, many people of Jewish descent, and even those who still identified as Jews, at some point became Orthodox believers and even Orthodox clergy. Even in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, there were certain tensions, and some bishops were hesitant to ordain Jewish priests. However, other bishops were more liberal, and there are a number of very influential priests of Jewish descent, whose names I mentioned on this channel repeatedly, such as Alexander Mein, Georgi Edelstein, and others. Currently, despite some possible individual beliefs, the Russian Orthodox Church is quite multi-ethnic. Naturally, there is a dominance of ethnic Russians due to the demographics of the country. However, more often than not, the ethnicity of a priest or a bishop, much less of a layman, does not play much role in the church. It is also important to note that just like in the Russian population, a large number of the clergy and faithful are Ukrainians. Historically, since Peter the Great practically made the church a state department, most of the key bishops were from Ukraine, so they did not have many strong connections in Moscow and St. Petersburg. What are some other things you have heard about the role of Jewish people in Russian history? Do you believe they left an impact on Russian Christianity? Share your opinion in the comments, but please be respectful about it and as objective as possible. Please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. I see you all next time.